Who are we really writing off from the candidates for President of the United States of America? And where and how can Shoigu and Gerasimov turn Putin in? For some reason, I thought so. We'll talk about that and more right now. My name is Iryna Uzlova, and with me is Igor Eidman, a sociologist and political scientist from Germany. Igor Vilenovich, hello, sincerely glad to see you.
Good afternoon, my sincere pleasure, Iryna.
Thank you for taking the time. I guess you and I are not the type to spread panic or catastrophic or all-consuming sentiments. Are we still betting on Biden or writing him off or waiting for some changes? How do you assess what might happen now before the second debate, and indeed before the main presidential race, I guess, of this year?
You know, anything could happen. The situation is completely uncertain right now and anything can happen. Because the health, and Biden's mental health above all, is unfortunately deteriorating badly before our eyes. And it's becoming clear to just about everyone, including his supporters, including Democrats. Perhaps apart from his immediate family, his wife and other people he consults and listens to. Because so far he himself and, apparently, his close circle, it seems to me, have not appreciated the degree of complexity, to put it mildly, of the situation for him. So what are the options? Biden may, if his physical health permits, continue this campaign. The first option. The second option. The Democrats will nominate, let's say, make an agreement with him not to run and give the electoral votes of his, to someone else, like Kamala Harris, yes, the vice president. From my point of view, this option is much better than the first one. Much better. There is still time before the Democratic Party convention, and in that time the party's donors, consultants, politicians, journalists who are already now, many publicly even saying that Biden should not run, can still convince him to make that change. The second option is that he won't leave after all, and he will continue to run and continue to campaign. This option is not catastrophic either, because what works here is that with Biden as a minimum, that is, who treats him well, he is pitied. Those who treat him badly laugh at him, and those who treat him well pity him. And as a politician, of course, it's a very unpleasant story. Politics pity humiliates a person, as Alexei Maximovich Gorky said. And the politician cannot be pitied, but admired. Biden is hardly admired by anyone right now. So I think with all that said, the vote will be against him, not for him. That is, against Trump. Those who categorically do not want Trump to come to power again, to be president again. Those who think he is a criminal, those who think he is a demagogue and a charlatan, and there are a lot of them. They want it, they don't want it, I don't know, with a disgruntled look on their face, grumbling, but they'll vote for Biden if he's the one, if he's a viable alternative to Trump. So there could be a story, you know, like there was when you elected Yeltsin in the 90s. Vote or lose. Yeltsin's rating was absolutely negligible, much lower than Biden's, and by the beginning of the pre-election campaign he had the same feeling as Biden. That is, those who sympathized with him, felt pity. Here was a man drunk and lost his adequacy before our eyes. So practically, with Biden it's old age and with Yeltsin it's alcoholism, something that mentally destroyed them. But, nevertheless, these people were forced, in order not to vote for the communists, not to vote for Zyuganov, to vote for Yeltsin, at least in the second round. But there is no runoff in the states, so they will be forced to vote for Biden if he opposes Trump. So this option is also possible, and it's, let's say, ambiguous, but it gives Biden a chance to keep Trump out. So he will still be elected. This, again, is not a zero probability. So, and in the first case, if someone young, relatively adequate Democrat runs against Trump, the likelihood of him winning is even higher. So I don't see some obvious, at least not catastrophic, disaster here. And let's hope for the best, and, let's say, the best is quite a probability in this case.
That's why, because not so much for Biden as in the battles against Trump, In fact, the level of support in the presidential candidates' battles is virtually unchanged in the Ipsos poll, not according to that CNN flash poll right off the bat, because those who were anti-Trump, they stayed as if they were figuratively for Biden.
Yes, of course. You see, this is the situation. Most, indeed, nearly two-thirds say Biden lost this debate. But that doesn't mean they state that Biden lost this debate. He obviously lost simply because he was mildly not that out of shape, but demonstrated that he's a very old, sick man. He's just not up to the challenge here. You see, it's the same as putting out some professional jock against a boxer, some poor old intelligent guy. Sure, a professional boxer of old will both score and win in this debate, but that doesn't mean everyone will support that boxer. And it's the same thing with this debate. Two-thirds say Trump won, but it had almost no effect nonetheless on their motivation to vote for Biden or Trump. Those who supported Biden overwhelmingly continue to support him. Those who supported Trump, again, continue to support him too. The problem is that the independent that this debate had a chance to further motivate independent voters not to vote for Trump, but to vote for Biden. That chance, of course, was not taken, it was missed. Missed because, as I said, at best Biden was pitied, at worst he was laughed at. So it's more of a minus than a plus for independents. However, there will be many events even before the elections, a lot. For example, there will be a judge's verdict on the first of 4 criminal cases against Trump that are already pending. And the judge's verdict, although most experts say it probably won't involve any jail time, but it will be a fine or something like that. But we'll live and see, because purely legally Trump can be locked up. We'll see how the judge behaves. So there's a lot of all sorts of other details here that could affect the outcome of the election even more than this ill-fated debate.
Igor Vilenovich, from what Trump said about the course of the Russian-Ukrainian war and the fact that he considers Putin's conditions, which he voiced on June 14 before the peace summit in Switzerland, unacceptable, already gives us reason to draw some conclusions about his attitude towards Putin and about his scenario for the denouement of the Russian-Ukrainian war. Or is he so unpredictable that this assessment is just so pointed, passing? There is no need to focus on how his potential coming to the helm of the White House, his relationship with the Russian dictator, whom he still assesses for some reason, who can be respected here, who not, who should be treated. For example, I don't care who Putin respects. I suppose you do too.
Absolutely. Yes. The fact is that what Trump says has no meaning, no sense at all. This is absolutely pure demagoguery. I even think that he often improvises, and it shows. It's just a blip. Ostap's gone off the rails. Trump's gone off the rails periodically, too. He can say anything. Now, of course, it is unprofitable for him to confirm rumors that he is linked to the Kremlin, to Putin. Therefore, he will not make any additional curtsies towards Putin, towards the Kremlin, so as not to alienate voters. Further, as I have already said, he is unpredictable. But, fortunately for the whole world, the United States is still a democracy. And the President of the United States is not a dictator of Russia or some kind of absolute monarch. And he can't, let's say, influence, certainly his personality, his views on the course of the country, but it's not an absolute influence. After all, there is a separation of powers in the USA. There is opposition in the USA. There is, let's say, a certain deterrent factor in the person of representatives of one's own party, i.e. the Republicans. We remember him from time to time. When he was president, he was periodically off the rails and came up with all sorts of delusional ideas. As we later learnt from the memoirs of his associates, who mostly betrayed him and told the public about all his miracles and pranks in their memoirs. For example, he wanted to dissolve NATO. He tried a lot to be weird, but he was somehow restrained. As a result, he didn't really screw up much while he was president. So that gives some sort of guarantee against too much of anything crazy should he come to power. Of course it would be a very bad thing. I have always said so and will continue to insist on it now. Trump coming to power would be very bad for the US, for the free world, for Ukraine, and, in general, for all adequate people. But it would still, I hope, not be a disaster, for one thing. Secondly, as I said before, I still don't believe right now that Trump will be President of the United States. We can conclude a party with you and then meet after the election and reminisce about him.
I always willingly believe your predictions that are based on analytics and facts. Therefore, I agree. We will just keep an eye on this prospect. Friends, if anyone is interested, Igor Vilenovich in our early broadcasts explained in detail, based on figures and political technological analysis, why in principle a Trump victory is impossible. Igor Vilenovich, please tell me, while in Germany, while communicating in Europe, have you followed the debates in the United States as closely as we have? Based, in particular, on thinking and building its own security, protection and defense structure in Europe, which, in principle, should understand that it is necessary not only to rely on the United States of America, but also on itself. Although we see that these processes are already taking place. Or is it not so closely assessed, analyzed, and are there any talks about it at all?
Yes. I will first still say the only possibility, the probability, however small from my point of view, of Trump coming in and returning to power again. That's if Biden's mental health deteriorates before his eyes and yet he doesn't provide the opportunity for some younger and more adequate Democrat to run as, say, an opponent of Trump, i.e., the Democratic nominee. I think the likelihood of that is slim, because after all, if he does go completely bad, after all, it will already be obvious and before the convention, I so hope, if it happens, of the Democratic Party. He will still be discouraged from running even there by his closest, nearest inner circle. Now, about Europe. Indeed, Europeans have long ago realized that they need to solve their problems themselves. They have long perceived the United States. We are for the United States like behind a stone wall. This is how the situation was perceived back in the Cold War, in the last Cold War, by the USSR, or the West Germans, whoever, the British. But, as we can see, yes, now they are beginning to understand that this is not quite such a stone wall. They need to solve the problem themselves and rely on their own strength. And indeed, a lot is being done for this now. And in particular, military production is rising, primarily in West Germany. And there are already projects, or rather, projects, but they have already launched the process of a sharp increase in the production of military equipment, military weapons, shells, especially shells. In West Germany from the 1st of January next year there will be very serious growth and very serious numbers there. These shells will also go to Ukraine. And the European Union, actually, the economy of the European Union in total, the population in total is larger than in the United States, and the economy is also in the direction of not less, at least for sure. And this is also a serious base that can be relied on. And no matter what happens there, the United States, the European Union and the largest countries, the European Union, for example, this is Germany, of course, they will not abandon Ukraine and will not allow anyone to give it up. And let's just say that all this talk that Europe has already turned away or will turn away, it's absolutely wrong, it's not true. There are some parties that are in favor of withdrawing support from Ukraine. But in Germany these parties are still a minority that have no chance of coming to power at the federal level, and in most European countries too. This is the first thing. And secondly, I have already said that the likelihood that the United States will somehow abandon Ukraine is close to zero in any case.
Yes, we like this kind of situation, and we, analyzing with our experts, come to the conclusion that, in principle, the support should not change that much, but the Kremlin is probably counting on something else, on other arrangements and scenarios. And Putin, who, don't get it, then basically everyone says he benefits, when Trump comes in, then he said in an interview with the morbid Tucker Carlson with his deviations like this that he was fine with Biden. Why did the Kremlin applaud after this debate, figuratively speaking? Or they also realize that this will not radically affect anything yet and there are various possible scenarios for the development of further events, which we have also mentioned.
The propagandists, of course, use this debate to pick on Biden. This is obvious and understandable. They have been trying to mock him for a long time. And naturally, they, of course, worked out this occasion 100%. As for Putin's statements about Trump, well, of course, he is promoting him. I have already talked about this. That is, Trump now needs to emphasize in every possible way that he is not connected with the Kremlin, and Putin is helping him in every possible way in this. He pretends to be afraid of Trump, and Trump proudly, as he always does, he's a narcissistic scary man, he starts proudly saying, "Here, look, Putin is afraid of me." Putin says he is very afraid of him coming to power. But it's a pure two-pronged PR stunt like this. Putin is preying Trump, pretending to be very afraid of him, and Trump is trying to use that to gain voter support. So in this sense, it's all kind of a game. As I have already said, the only thing about the situation with Trump is that there are two circumstances that should reassure us. First of all, as I said, despite everything, he does not have many chances to be elected. This is the first thing. And secondly, the United States has a system of checks and balances, separation of powers and so on. He will not be allowed to frolic in any case, even if, God forbid, he were to get into the White House again.
Accepted. Let's move on. While we haven't seen you, the beginning of this week pleased us that the International Criminal Court has found Putin's companions that he himself has found to wage a bloody war against us for the past 11 years. They are Shoigu and Gerasimov. They now have warrants on them as well. They will sit together, everyone will sit down. I've joked about asking them not where the ammunition is, but where the breadcrumbs are. Or, as people joke, where the lawyers are, and lawyers are unlikely to help them in this life. But that's what I thought today. For some reason, I decided to ask you too. Is it possible that the same Shoigu or Gerasimov and the others who will be joining their inglorious ranks of Hague Tribunal order-bearers may at some point conspire, think, reflect on the fact that they do not want to be hanged on the gallows and hand Putin over not only to the Hague Tribunal, but somewhere else, and maybe even hang all the sins on him afterwards?
Of course, there is such an option, but on the other hand it will not save them. Because if we remember when Milosevic was surrendered, but nevertheless his closest henchmen, his closest entourage, including a participant in the war, they sat down with Milosevic. It was not Milosevic who sat in their place, but they sat down with Milosevic. Mladic, Karadzic and the rest. So I think that nothing will save people like Shoigu and Gerasimov, and I don't think they hope for it. Nadiatsa na tu, sito mogat dat Putina, a zeno I Shoigu, I Gerasimova. Those who, at least so far, and, let's say, are not perceived in the West as war criminals who will be imprisoned in any case. There are many of them at the top of Russia. They, you see, are very careful, while carefully picking up. I think that, let's say, people who have already been written off, who have one path, either hold on with all the forces of power, or go to prison. These are Putin and the security forces, the leaders of the security forces, that is, current and former. That is, the same Shoigu, Gerasimov, Patrushev, Bortnikov, Zolotov. This is on the one hand. On the other hand, there are people who, at least for now, and who are so far, at least in the West, perceived as such realists, pragmatists, who have not yet been listed as war criminals. They are just about to carry out this coup, and they are just motivated to return their former quite comfortable life by betraying the security forces and betraying Putin, when they earned, or rather, stole in Russia, but actually lived in two houses. They had a second home somewhere in London or on the Côte d'Azur. And they drove back and forth on their business jets and lived, in general, happily ever after, not knowing what problems and fears they had. There are also many such people in the Russian leadership. This is the same Mishustin. This is the Prime Minister. This is the Mayor of Moscow, Sobyanin. This is the entire economic bloc, that is, the people who deal with Russia, the economy, finance, who, by the way, despite the fact that they are actually already military, they also serve, at least, the criminal regime. Until recently, they were considered almost liberals. There is some kind of Nabiullina, the head of the central bank, finance minister Siluanov and so on and so forth. There are many of these people. They are in close contact with the Russian oligarchs. They lobby for their interests, they do common business with them, and they control a lot of money. And if there is money, there are also potential opportunities for any political rhythms, for any political constructions, coups and so on.
And what are they, Igor Vilenovich, waiting for? Any more warrants for someone, when there will be even more of them or more failures for Putin at the front?
Do you know what they're waiting for? We don't know how much they are waiting. Perhaps, while we are talking, they have also gathered somewhere, sharing the skin of Putin, who has not yet been killed, unfortunately. This is on the one hand. On the other hand, they really understand that the risks are great. If they get together and start doing something, the security forces, who control the situation, who are watching them, can, of course, somehow stop them, as they call it, at the root, destroy them, and so on and so forth. They must realize that procrastination is like death. As Lenin said before the October coup, that if they don't make this coup now, tomorrow they will go to The Hague together with Putin. To do this, Putin must, obviously, completely lose the war. Unfortunately, so far, he is obviously not losing this war, so they are apparently waiting. But it has to be said that the very notion of losing, by the way, I will now divert a little from this topic, but it is important, losing a war is perhaps misunderstood by many experts. For Putin, losing the war is even a transition to its totality. For example, new mobilizations, like this whole situation of the totality of the war, that you have to raise the country up and lead it to slaughter. In general, he is not ready for this psychologically and mentally. And for him it is, let's say, the transition of this war, as he now perceives it, local for himself, into a total war, where he must become the leader of the warring nation. For him it is already a defeat. And if he has no other choice but to announce a new wave of total mobilization, he will perceive it as a loss of war, and his entourage, the people we have just talked about, will perceive it as a loss of war. It could also be an incentive for them to stage this coup.
Many of us really have both the notion of winning and losing more than abstract and with fuzzy contours. But when many say that Putin is ready for a protracted long war, they are in fact mistaken, apparently, because even this transfer of the economy to the military, this mobilization, you and I have said repeatedly that it is not profitable for him, he will not go, he does not want to. He is not ready really for a new public, at least a new round. Therefore, he is not ready for such a protracted war either. Well, yes, where is Kiev in 3 days, and where is the protracted war, if not to fight at one imperial idea?
Of course, he is not ready for a protracted war, he did not plan it. He was planning a blitzkrieg. He was planning a blitzkrieg, because there, well, in a few days, maybe not 3 days, but a few weeks to take over Ukraine, to put his puppet there. He saw the situation and was oriented, apparently, by the Soviet experience. As, for example, the Soviet Union suppressed the Prague Spring almost bloodlessly. That is, the Czech army was isolated, and it did not resist. The Czechoslovak army did not resist the Soviet army. This is what he was counting on in Ukraine. This blitzkrieg story, the idea of him and blitzkrieg, it's a deafening failure. He is waging this war not because he wanted it, this long war. It is he who will tell us everything in the fairy tale that everything is going according to plan for him. In fact, everything goes against his plans, perpendicular to his plans. But he keeps driving it because he has nowhere else to go. He can't back down, he can't say that, I screwed up, I failed. For him, this meant a manifestation of weakness. He was afraid, because his favorite entourage, which conveys information to him, I think, everyone has a knife behind their back. And he will quickly be told that Aquila missed and was destroyed. Therefore, he is waging this war by inertia, purely by inertia. In general, there is simply nowhere to go. And he is not ready for a long war, for an active long war, which would require additional, more efforts than now, including general mobilization and so on. He is ready for some kind of protracted cycling war, which would not greatly affect the situation in Russia, in order to prepare a new blitz out, which, in his opinion, would finally work. This would be quite likely for him to do this. But, of course, neither Ukraine nor the West are ready for this.
Well, yes, maybe they are preparing. Foreign Affairs wrote this week that the so-called elites, well, these elites who call themselves the elites of the Kremlin, are preparing for a war against a small NATO country. They say they might take Narva in Estonia. Perhaps they want such a blitzkrieg, since it did not work out in Ukraine, although I cannot understand how they will get there, but nevertheless they have their own reality and their own picture in their heads. Here's a blitzkrieg on NATO countries. Maybe that's the scenario now.
No, I think not. Let's say that the war in Ukraine, it saved NATO. It saved NATO countries from Putin's aggression, because Putin, tied up in Ukraine, cannot realize his other ambitious maniacal plans. Until he ends the war in Ukraine, he will certainly not attack NATO. If he cannot carry out some successful, obvious offensive actions in Ukraine, of course, against NATO, which is a much more serious military force, he will not be able to pull it off either. Therefore, he can only intimidate, he can threaten, brandish his nuclear warheads, but, of course, he will not do anything. I even think that his next victim would not even be a NATO country, but Moldova. Very clearly, Russians are terribly dissatisfied with such a democratic European course of today's Moldova. They believe that Moldova is an easy victim, unlike Ukraine, because the army is weak enough. And Afghanistan is concentrated with serious Russian force and weapons. Therefore, the next victim would have been, if, God forbid, Putin had succeeded in his blitzkrieg with Ukraine, then it would have been Moldova, most likely. But further, of course, NATO countries would also be under threat.
Yes, thank you for that understanding, and thank you to our armed forces today, always and thousands of times a minute, for stopping Russian aggression, even though it doesn't really stop anywhere. The entire front line with a length of more than 1,000 kilometers is burning in the literal figurative sense of the word. Igor Villanovich, something is burning in Bastrykin, I believe, the head of the investigative committee of the Russian Federation. This week he has been shining with some absurd statements, not that they seem to correspond to reality, at least we are hearing something real from someone, but they are angry about it in Russia. So, then he says that it is not the Duma, but the State Jura, as it is commonly called in our country, and not only, then he says that he and Kadyrov are somehow quarreling, they can't find a common religious staple. What do you think is happening to Bastrykin?
Yes. It seems to me that the same thing has been happening to Bastrykin for a long time as to most of the Russian elite. Quietly and leisurely he is going crazy. That is, he has been behaving inadequately for a long time. Just if you follow his actions, what he just didn't do. Well, for example, when Navalny was still at large and in good political shape, Bastrykin, as Russian journalists discovered, published absolutely graphomaniac poems against Navalny on the website, I think, stihi.ru, such an open platform where anyone can publish. And they were clearly written in a drunken state, because there is such a graphomania at the level of a drunken teenager of 14 years old. Bastrykin took the correspondent of Novaya Gazeta to the forest, threatened him that now he would be buried here, and then he himself would investigate his murder. This is also a well-known fact. All this can be found on the internet. That is, Bastrykin is an absolutely inadequate person who holds on to his place, to his chair simply because his other maniac Putin has long known him well and he trusts him. This is the second time I have used this word, because it is typical for Russian politicians. And Ostap was carried away. He began to talk a little. That is, it was one thing when he had already threatened journalists and mocked Navalny in some crazy rhymes. It was all within the framework of the Russian political mainstream. But now, for some reason, he decided to call the State Duma. That is certainly what the Gosduma considers it in Russia, but if not all, then the vast majority of people in Russia. But to the politicians of the Russian ruling elite, some sort of subordination, it certainly forbids such predeterminations against it on an official level. The same with Kadyrov. It is generally dangerous to quarrel with Kadyrov in Russia. Usually, those who quarrel with Kadyrov, some time after the visit of dear Chechen guests, for some reason, they begin to apologize loudly and almost smash their foreheads in these bows to Kadyrov. Let's see what will happen to Bastrykin, but, as I said, he has long been inadequate. And now the whole scandal is only in the fact that, due to his inadequacy, he began to violate this bureaucratic subordination, which is sacred in Russia.
Can he be threatened with anything, except for instability and dangerous manifestations from Kadyrov's so-called troops? Or while they also forgive him and observe him, will he suddenly improve for the better?
It all depends on Putin's attitude towards him. We don't know this. But if Putin continues to treat him well and patronize him, Bastrykin is in absolutely no danger. There, Volodin, anyone, even Kadyrov, can jump out of their pants. But if he has Putin's roof working, then he will not have any problems. In terms of age, he should have been retired a long time ago, because he is well past 70, and it is considered that at 70 years old Russian law enforcers should retire. But none of this happens. We see that everyone is almost over 70, and Bortnikov is over 70, but he also maintains his position, the head of the Federal Security Service. So everything depends not on the law, and not on public opinion, but only on the desire, on the attitude of the dictator towards you. If the dictator favors, then a person can sit completely insane at least up to 100 years in his place.
That is, these disagreements between them, misunderstandings between, for example, Bastrykin and Kadyrov, they cannot lead to anything. As long as Putin controls this, and as long as his protégés can resolve it, then we should not expect any confrontation or incitement of conflicts.
No, I don't think so. You see, these are not the right people. This Bastrykin is the same, absolutely Putin's, still connected to the St. Petersburg Mafia. He appeared in wiretaps. The St. Petersburg Mafia was wiretapped in Spain. The group of a certain Gina Petrov, they all lived in Spain, and the police wiretapped them, and then after their trial, they managed to escape. But there was a trial. These wiretaps got into the media, where they discussed and including the appointment of Bastrykin, these mafiosi, these so-called Malishev's criminal group. They discussed the appointment of Bastrykin as the appointment of their man. That is, this is all one mafia, absolutely, and here we cannot expect any significant changes. I have already said that the threat to Putin comes from those who are trying to maintain some kind of relative acceptability for the West from such civilian officials, oligarchs, who are trying to reintegrate into the world's proprietary elite, as they were integrated before. From such people, but not from people like Bastrykin or, I don't know, some Bortnikov, Patrushev. These are all such old Putin's guards, absolute, of course, grandfathers and madmen. In general, you should not expect anything special from them.
Yes, I agree, Igor Vilenovich, and I have some philosophical question at the end of our conversation. We learned that Putin offered to arm the Houthis with cruise missiles, but he was told by the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, you can't do that. I realize that the scales are incomparable, but nevertheless, can no one, for example, not even China, tell him when it will be profitable for China or someone else or by some other forceful methods to stop the dictator and tell him to withdraw his Russian occupation troops? And why does the world continue to allow him to scale his aggression?
You see, the supply of missiles to the Houthis is not a fundamental moment for Putin. Here he can make concessions to Soldovskaya Arabia, with which Russia cooperates, including in containment, or rather, not in containment, but, say, in restraining the decline in oil prices, that is, in supporting high oil prices. That is, he can easily refuse. Well, maybe supply missiles to the Houthis too on the west, maybe not. And the war against Ukraine, including the occupation of these territories that they have already occupied, is an absolutely fundamental thing for Putin. For him, this is a consequence of his paranoid, super-valuable ideas. And here he cannot make concessions. Who would not ask him for these concessions? Apparently, even by open information, Putin's partners like China, India, Turkey, are urging Putin, openly urging Putin to freeze the war. And this would be beneficial for Putin, because to fix the situation that is now. Because it will be worse for him in the future, I absolutely believe it. But even this he does not go for. And we see that in the latter he had a completely impudent statement. Not only did he not agree to an immediate truce, which the same Chinese elder brother is offering him, but he also demanded, as a precondition, that Ukraine still give him the territory that has not yet been occupied. So in this position, in the paranoid position that is fundamental to him, in the paranoid ideas that are important to him, he cannot retreat. He can somehow imitate the desire for peace, rant something there, but in principle he cannot retreat. And we see this in his attitude, among other things, to the so-called peace proposals from China, Turkey and other countries with which he maintains good relations.
Igor Vilenovich, Thank you very much for your always interesting comments, for your professional analysis and for your forecasts in particular. Thank you. Until next time, take care of yourself.
Thank you, Iryna. Take care. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye. Igor Eidman, a sociologist and political scientist from Germany, was with me, and I was Iryna Uzlova. Friends, please subscribe to the Eidman News Telegram channel. A description of it, a link, an active direct can be found just under this video. There are even more links to interviews, as well as reasoning and analysis from Igor Vilenovich. And subscribe to YouTube of Channel 24 please. Your subscription allows our conversations to advance its vastness. Take care of yourself, believe in the armed forces of Ukraine. See you and win.